This is Nasha Kasha, Ukrainian Almanac, 28 minutes of stories for everyone about Ukrainian life. I am your reporter, Stefan Andrusiak, and this is episode 266. It was first aired in October of 2017, and I will have an update at the end of the program. There are colleagues that you will meet in your places of work who will become your friends. Then you or they might move far away. I first met Richard Zurawski when we both worked at CBC Television News in Windsor, Ontario. Richard would grow from his role as a popular TV weather forecaster to become the host of Canada's best-known TV children's science discovery show called Wonder Why. He would write books, enter federal, then municipal politics, work on completing his doctorate degree, and he has become a Halifax city councillor. Today on Nasha Kasha, I bring you Richard's story. The one the public doesn't yet know, the one he himself didn't fully discover or understand until well into his adult life. It's a story that would take him to Ukraine.
This is the heart of the city.
It's a Friday night in Halifax. Larissa and I are walking with Richard and his wife Susan.
And we're approaching Spring Garden Road right now, which is sort of a upscale commercial district. Good restaurants and some stores.
Richard has lived in Halifax for almost 3 decades. He is currently a councillor in District 12 of the Halifax Regional Municipality.
It's approaching 500,000. It's kind of a dynamic city. It's starting to grow now, but it's an ocean city, small enough to be friendly, but large enough to be economically viable. So there's many universities here. It's the dynamo of the Maritimes in Atlantic Canada. I'm Richard Zurawski, councillor, Halifax. I'm a meteorologist and a lecturer at St. Mary's University. I was born in Bedford, England. We immigrated to Canada in 1954, and we lived in Toronto for about 5 years. Then the next 12 years, I lived in the Midland area, which is in the Georgian Bay, southern Georgian Bay area, in a little village called Victoria Harbour. Then I went to University of Toronto, University of Windsor, lived in Windsor for about 10 years. In the last 30 years, 29 years actually, I've been in Halifax. I thought I was German. My father was Polish. This is what I thought. My father spoke German. The only relatives I knew and the only friends we knew were all German. So I spoke German. That was the language of the home. I thought I had a German heritage, and my father always said, no, we're Polish, and there's nobody left after the war. I had an uncle, 2 uncles, who lived in Canada. The remainder of my mother's family, there were 3 sisters, lived in Germany. So we were immersed, my family was immersed in a German culture. And in the Midland area was a large German plant called Lights, the Ernst Lights optics factory. And so I even had a summer job there once. So there was a large German community as well. And we also, when we came to Canada, integrated with the German community in Toronto.
And then things were revealed to you, or through research, or by dint of your own determination?
The stories didn't make sense. On my mother's side, everything was clear. You know, where they lived, how they lived, who we were related to, the history, the timeline. And they went back 300 years in this area of East Prussia, which is now part of Poland. And all of that was clear and made sense to me. My father's story, the more I asked, the more convoluted it became, and there were contradictions that I started to pick up.
Could you talk to your dad? Was it a warm relationship? Were you close?
It was very close when I was a boy, and there were certain incidents that happened that brought us closer. He was very protective. He could be very kind, but he was mercurial. He could go to anger very quickly, and he was very corporal. I got spanked a lot. But there was also an explanation that went with it. My father always seemed troubled, I guess, was it. And when he was questioned, he would get angry, and that's how he would deal things.
Brothers, sisters?
I had a brother. He was born when I was 8 years old, and he died. He committed suicide. He died 15 years ago. Yeah.
But you grew up together in
we grew up,
your parents' care.
We grew up together, yes. So we had a small nuclear family. We had a small group of German friends. My father worked in a German factory. He had no Polish friends. This is what always amazed me. He knew there was a few Polish people, but he didn't socialize with them. He didn't go to Catholic church, which was very unusual for most Polish people. And he didn't speak Polish, and he didn't socialize.
You know, sometimes you just immerse yourself in the family and friends of your mate.
Exactly. And that's the way it was for many years. By the time I got to be about 12 or 13 years old, I started to question things. So I said, so tell me about your father. Tell me about your mother. Tell me about the street you lived on. And very often I would get, I don't remember. It's a long time ago, and it was during the war. And at first, that was a Band-Aid for the question, and I stopped, and then I thought, oh, he said he was born in 1919, so that means, how could you forget at the age of 20 where you lived? And then there was some confusion about his birth date. He said it was 1919, but there was also some question about it being 1927. And then I remember he had a bit of a falling out with my uncles, the two brothers of my mother. They were always contentious, and one day one of my uncles said, well, you know, it's because he's a Jew. And I went, what? Well, your father's Jewish. And I went, oh, well, that's interesting. And I sort of kept it to myself, and I started asking more questions.
Of your dad?
Of my dad, yes. And of course he denied and denied and denied. But every once in a while, we would get stories, especially early in the morning. That seemed to be the time for him. He would wake up at 5 in the morning, get ready to go to work, and he'd have a coffee and a cigarette, and he'd sit there by himself with a smoke wreath going over his head, and he was very quiet and still, and you could see him trying to look back and trying to look ahead, but sort of balancing himself in the present. And that's when we would have our moments of conversation. And he would tell me about the streets of Lvov, which was a Polish city before the war, and the chestnuts and walnuts trees and the boulevards and the hotels and that kind of thing. And then I started to get information. And he said, well, all the family's dead. There's nobody left. And I said, so have you looked? And he says, yes, I've looked, and there's nobody there. They all died. And I said, why did they die? And, of course, he said it was the war. It wasn't a continuous questioning on my part, because for my father, he was busy making a living. He worked in a factory. He worked on weekends. He built houses, to make life better. They saved their money, like all immigrants to Canada, like your family and the other families that I knew. They scraped, they struggled, they worked, they contributed, they tried to integrate to the population as much as they could, but also maintain their distinct identity. For us, I had a half identity. I had a German identity from my mother, East Prussian, and it was very towards the Nazi leaning from my uncles. It was always this nascent, well, they've sort of misinterpreted the war. Hitler was misunderstood. It's because we lost the war that he's so bad. In reality, it's not so bad. And it just sort of stuck for a while. And by the time I got to university, I sort of left that behind. But as my father got older, I started to realize that not all of this made sense because I started talking with other people. And I started to get an inkling. The words started to echo from my uncles saying, he's a Jew. Then I remembered an occurrence that happened when I was a little boy. There was a boy named Joey whose father was a Jewish shopkeeper. He had a store on the corner of College and Beatrice in Christie Pitt's area of Toronto. And one day, Joey his father picked him up at school at the Clinton Street public school we went to. I was in grade 1. And the boys had circled him, this sort of group of boys that I hung around with. And they started chanting, Jew, Jew, Jew. And they started spitting at him and taunting him. This would have been 1958. And I joined in. It was like an exciting, ravenous pack kind of thing, like we were empowered. And he turned around and he pointed at one of the boys, and beside me, he said, "Oh, I know you. You're Henry's son." And then all of a sudden, I just froze, like I was frozen in concrete, because I knew my father would be very upset if he heard anything like that I'd done anything like this. And he just sort of said, "You guys leave us alone." And the other boys scattered, and I was like a deer in the headlights. And he shook his head, and he walked away with Joey, and he sort of cleaned the spittle off his trench coat. And then I didn't hear anything for a couple of weeks. And one day, my father and I are walking out on a Saturday down Beatrice Street to go to college. And, of course, I was in tow. And I saw Joey's father across the road walking with Joey. And he motioned for my father to come in, and I was terrified. And my father went and talked to him, and he was nodding his head and listening. And then he came over to me, and he just leaned over. And he said, "You shouldn't do that. You know, this is our people." And he looked at me with tears in his eyes, and then nothing more happened. And it was something that I won't forget. I had accumulated a whole pile of information about my father, finding which concentration camp he had been in, and in his last year of life, he said, yes, we were Jewish. And so I thought, I have to go. I have to go to Lviv. We had 2 stores, and I found the stores. One was on Blaney Street, and the other was on Academia Street. One of the stores was in the ghetto. When we went to Lviv, we went into that area, and there used to be a synagogue across the road, which is now just an open plaza. We were able to see the restaurant. The unfortunate thing was that there was a swastika spray painted in it, so the remembrances of anti-Semitism run very, very deep in Lviv, and that was the disappointing part of it. The city itself was pretty much untouched by the war. There was no bombing, so it was beautiful, and much of it echoed of what my father has said it was like. The hills, the wooded areas, the churches. Finding the records on internet from he was in a concentration camp called Flossenburg, and in the final days before the march to Bergen-Belsen, he and 2 others escaped, one Polish, one Jewish guy, and they picked up uniforms and passed themselves off as Polish soldiers and joined the Polish troops that were moving in the final days of the war against the Germans. And then he always said, if you did something to survive the concentration camps and the wars, you did things you were ashamed of. He had passed himself off as Polish, not Jewish. That was what saved him. And in 1941, when the Russians were pushed out by the Germans in Lviv, his family was exterminated in the first week. He happened to be with his gang. In the afternoons, he'd hang out, and somebody told him to run. He hid for almost a year in and around Lviv. In the shtetls. He had some family there, and they hid him, and then he was picked up and processed as a Polish orphan and put into slave labor. And he would have been about 14 or 15 at the time.
How could you hide in the shtetl? Everybody's Jewish.
Everybody's Jewish, but he hid in the forest. And he had two older brothers who were in the resistance, and so they sort of supported each other. And so he hid out. He had an aunt who had a farm, and she was a widow, and he hid in the fields in the farm.
Did he ever tell you about treatment by the Ukrainian people at the time that he was hiding or growing up?
It's interesting. I never really knew the difference between Ukrainian and Polish when I was growing up. I thought they'd all lived in the same area. There was no difference. He spoke Ukrainian, he spoke Polish, he spoke Yiddish, and he never really differentiated. What he was afraid of were the Germans, the Nazis. He said if you survived, there were no good people and bad people. It was just a matter of survival. And if you went through the war, it was horror for everybody.
What was the experience like of retracing his steps in Lviv? What did you go there looking for? What did you come out of it with?
It gave me an identity. I grew up with no identity on his side. And all of a sudden, it was clear all the things that he had done. Where we shopped in Toronto, we went to Kensington Market, which was the Jewish market. He went to the shopkeepers and talked in Yiddish with them. My mother never knew he spoke Yiddish. He never spoke Yiddish around her. And so I said, well, he spoke this language. He spoke Russian, Polish, German, English, Ukrainian. He had a facility for language, and he spoke Yiddish. And he said, no, he never spoke Yiddish. I go, what? He always spoke Yiddish. And he...
Perhaps she was trying to protect his secret.
Well, she said, and I asked her about this, she said that when he... She had a bad story, too. She left Germany when she was 19 years old, 1947, came to the UK, and things were so bad because the Russians had come through and a lot of their family had been killed by the Russians. The end of the war was awful, and there was forced starvation in Germany for 2 years to put down the insurgencies. A lot of people don't realize that there was a lot of guerrilla warfare going on in Germany from 1945 to 1947, and there was a planned starvation that killed about 2 million Germans to put down the last of the resistance, and there was pockets of resistance all over the place. So she left and went to England, and this is where my father met my mother. And somebody said to him, you speak German, there's this German woman working close by, and you should get to know her. And so they started going out. He got her pregnant, and he was about to leave her, out of revenge. And then he had a change of heart, and he stayed with her. And for my mother, she said that when she met him, she didn't care about his past. She didn't care about anything, and they just started from ground zero when they got married. Interesting thing, when she was teaching me about birds and bees, when I was about 7 years old, she said to me, pregnancies last about 9 months, except for the first one. That can be any length of time. Because I was conceived in November, they got married in April, and she was very embarrassed about that. And she said, I know he could have left me. He didn't have to stay. So I was always grateful that he stayed, so I made the best of it. And then they came to love each other.
Nasha Kasha comes to you from CHRW 94.9 FM on the campus of Western University in London, Ontario. We're heard on CHMR 93.5 FM in St. John's, Newfoundland, on CKDU 88.1 FM in Halifax, on Local 107.3 FM in St. John, New Brunswick, on CJAS Radio 93.5 FM in Saint Augustine, Quebec, on CJLO 1690 AM in Montreal, on CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston, on CFMU 93.3 FM in Hamilton, on CKMS 102.7 FM in Kitchener-Waterloo, on CJAM 99.1 FM in Windsor and Detroit, on CKLU 96.7 FM in Sudbury, on CILU 102.7 FM in Thunder Bay, on 101.5 UMFM in Winnipeg, on CJTR 91.3 FM in Regina, on CFMQ 98.1 FM in Hudson Bay, Saskatchewan, on CFBX 92.5 FM in Kamloops, on CJSF 90.1 FM in Vancouver, and on CHLY 101.7 FM in Nanaimo, British Columbia. Would you go back to Ukraine?
I'd love to go back. Lviv is one of the most beautiful cities. It's unfortunate that its architecture is degrading because it's still having economic difficulties, and there isn't a whole lot of money for that. And there's a lot of poverty, especially the old people, 70s, 80s, 90s. There was a lot of begging for money, and especially women. They're completely disenfranchised, and it's a heartbreakingly beautiful city. And the history is long and glorious.
Speaking of the history, did you seek out the Jewish history of that part of the world?
I tried to seek out the Jewish history, but there's only about 100 families left. From 100,000 indigenous Jews that live there, there's maybe 100 families left. One synagogue. They want to be left alone. They're afraid of the anti-Semitism.
Which year were you there in?
2010. It was one of the great experiences we had, both for my mother to go back and see my father before. And we could see my father in our mind's eye before she had met him, because she had never even thought about it. And she has apologized constantly for saying, well, I don't know anything about him beforehand because we never talked about it. He didn't want to be questioned, and I respected that.
I think quite a few people cleaned the slate when they met after the war and just said, let's just start from here.
I think you're right.
You can find Nasha Kasha at nashakasha.libsyn.com. Nasha Kasha is one word. Libsyn is spelled Libsyn. nashakasha.libsyn.com. Nasha Kasha is supported in part by the Shevchenko Foundation and the Ukrainian Credit Union. I first met you when you were a meteorologist on a television newscast that we both worked at. You took that expertise in science, combined it with your childlike wonder, and went into children's science shows.
I am firmly convinced that storytelling is what engages young people. And so I had the opportunity to create children's shows in science and mathematics and weather. And I found children to be so receptive to it. Adults, not so much.
You were specifically recruited from Ontario to come to the Maritimes to do this kind of work.
Yes. ATV, which was part of the CTV conglomerate, and there were a number of different owners of CTV at the time. ATV, the Atlantic Television System, needed a meteorologist because a new television station started up with the Irving family called MITV, and a lot of the people had left, so they had vacancies, and they called me up to be their meteorologist. What really attracted me was they also wanted me to create a children's science show called Wonder Why, which was aired on CTV. So I did that. I wrote it and hosted it and created it, and it was exciting. And we got kids together, and it was very, very exciting times.
So kids growing up in the 90s across the country would recognize your name.
It finished in 1994. So from 88 to 94, we did 65 episodes. And so it was sold 200 countries around the world. So it became sort of the signature brand of CTV science at that time.
You took that wonder of your own in science, and you propelled it through a production career, making documentaries, and then into politics.
Right now, communications is probably the most important thing in my life, which obviously led to the politics. I started to realize that the communications part and making changes based on science could only be affected through politics.
You took the communications industry, specifically television, to task for the poor job that they were doing in Canada in science.
Yes, I did. I wrote a book called Media Mediocrity.
You don't have a lot of patience for people who don't trust science, especially on environmental issues.
Yeah, and I guess that's my weakness.
Or a strength.
Well, I envy people who are more diplomatic than I am. And right now we've got a number of crises affecting us. Probably the environmental crisis is the worst one we have. It's almost a certitude. Historically and geologically, we have had increases in ocean level as much as a foot per decade. And so we are now at a stage where we've got so much carbon in the atmosphere that this is almost a certitude. And for anybody to say otherwise, it's just dreaming.
So it is no surprise to anybody that you joined the Green Party.
It is my job, as I see, to make life better.
Today, Richard Zurawski is a science contributor at radio station Q104 in Halifax. He retired from teaching and he has left municipal politics. Now, he is a candidate for leadership of the Green Party in the province of Nova Scotia. There's a tribute to his late father on Richard's Facebook page. He wrote June 30th, 2021, quote, 80 years ago today, the Nazis invaded and crushed Lwów, in what was then Poland, murdered my father's entire family, making him an orphan and sole survivor. He hid a year before they found him, put him in a concentration camp, making him a slave and brutalizing him, until he escaped with 2 others just before they were to be death-marched to Bergen-Belsen. They were found by and they joined the Polish Allies and were part of the liberation from the Nazis. After the war, he went on to fight in Palestine for the creation of Israel. Never again. Never. Mazel tov, my father. End of quote.
Earlier in the program, you heard a traditional Polish mazurka by the Newfoundland Ukrainian band, the Kubasonics.
And here it is again.
Violinist Mela Tenenbaum performed Friedrich Chopin's Mazurka in A minor, Opus 67, number 4, from her album Tea Time. And you heard Chotar's Lemko Karpatho-Rusin folk song, Lemkowska Piosenka. New Pathway Ukrainian News delivers news and insight every week in English and Ukrainian. Subscribe today at newpathway.ca. Back in a week, God willing. До милої зустрічі за тиждень часу, дорогі слухачі.